Hello students, we know in this time we discuss about the preferences, something that you think is much better than another one, and you choose that one is better than another one. Something is higher or something is lower. Here in this video, the discussion is about the preferences with the use of would, prefer, and had better. To know further, you will watch this video.
Today, we're going to learn how to express preferences in English. As you can see in the picture, it's important to know what to say in English when we are offered something and we need to express our preference. Okay. First of all, let's talk about general preferences, okay? Because there is a very important difference between general and specific preferences, okay? If it's a general preference, the verb that we tend to use is the verb prefer, okay? So let's take a look at some examples. We can say, I prefer to live in the country, or we could also say, I prefer living in the country. Okay, any of the two possibilities are correct, right? Because prefer admits or accepts the two formats, prefer plus to infinitive or prefer plus ing or gerund, all right? And both of them would be correct and the meaning is exactly the same. Okay, when we're talking about general preferences, it means that this preference doesn't have anything to do with a specific time or moment. It's just something that we prefer in our life, okay, in general, but it's not connected to right now or a specific moment in time, all right? Okay, so how do we use prefer? Let's see some examples. Right, as you can see, you have three statements and they're incomplete, okay? So let's try to complete them. The first one, I prefer tea, there is a missing word in between, okay? And the word, in case you haven't guessed it, is to, okay? So we can say, I prefer tea to coffee. And this is a general preference, something that we normally prefer in our lives. Example 2 is, I prefer driving, and then something missing, and walking. Have you guessed it? Okay, it should be, I prefer driving to walking. So in the exactly the same way as example number 1, the missing word is to. Let's take a look at number 3. I prefer to drive and then walk. There is something again missing. Okay, I'll give you some time. And then the missing part should be, I prefer to drive rather than walk. Okay, so the three examples are examples that contain the verb prefer, okay? The three examples are examples to show our general preference about something, but grammatically they behave differently, okay? So the first example, as you can see, you have two nouns, tea and coffee, and what we have in between is the preposition to. The second example, we are using the gerund ending in ing, and that's why we have to as well. But pay attention, because when we decide to use the to infinitive, what we need to use in between is the expression rather than. Okay, and bear in mind that the second part or the second verb should be a bare infinitive or an infinitive without to. Okay, let's take a look at some pictures. All right, imagine that you're speaking in general. Okay, you could say something like this. I prefer the beach to the mountain, okay? And then again, remember that if we are using nouns such as beach and mountain, in between we would need to use the preposition to, okay? And then another example would be this one here. We could also use the gerund and say, I prefer reading to listening to music, okay? This would be similar to the example 2 that we saw earlier. Or finally, you could say, I prefer to read rather than listen to music. Okay, so in the third example, remember that when we use the to plus infinitive, such as here, we need to join it with rather than and then use a bare infinitive again. As I said earlier, these two examples mean exactly the same. Okay, now let's move on to specific preferences. Okay, what kind of preferences are these? These are specific and they have something to do with a specific moment or a specific time. Let's take a look at this photo. Okay, as you can see, there is a couple at a restaurant and a waiter. And for specific preferences, we are going to use would prefer and not only prefer. Okay, so we would need to use would prefer, and with the contraction, okay, it's going to be apostrophe D and then prefer. So for instance, the waiter is going to ask, would you prefer red or white wine? As you can see, this preference question, okay, is very specific. Okay, the waiter is not asking the lady, okay, what do you prefer in your real life, in your everyday life, but what would you prefer right now at the restaurant? Okay, that's why it's a specific preference. So would you prefer red or white wine? And the answer is going to be, I'd prefer white, please. Okay, this is a specific preference in the sense that he is expressing what he would like to have right now in this specific moment. Okay, that's why he's saying I would prefer, or with the contraction I'd prefer, and not only I prefer. Okay, so I'd prefer white, please. Another situation, okay, two friends and one is asking, shall we go by train? Okay, because it's a specific situation, a specific question, then he's going to reply, I'd prefer to drive. Okay, so he's expressing what he prefers, but then he's using again would prefer. Okay, but remember, when we use would prefer, okay, we are going to use to. Okay, I would prefer to drive. Okay, and then we couldn't say, oops, let me just wait for this to go away, sorry. We couldn't say I prefer driving, okay, because with the structure would prefer, okay, compulsorily you need to use the to infinitive. I would prefer to drive. Okay, let's take a look at another example. Okay, there is another couple, and then the guy is going to say, how about going out tonight? Okay, next she's going to say, okay, I'd prefer to stay at home rather than go out tonight. Okay, as you can see again, we have this same structure, I would prefer, followed by to. I'd prefer to stay at home, but then pay attention to the continuation of the statement, rather than go out. Okay, so when we use would prefer to, okay, the second part of the statement of the sentence is rather than, and then the bare infinitive or the infinitive without to. Okay, now for specific preferences as well, okay, apart from would prefer, we could use would rather, okay, which is exactly the same, has the same meaning. Okay, both expressions mean the same. Okay, we use both when we are giving our specific preferences or preferences that have to do with a specific moment or a specific time. Okay, so remember that this is the structure or the pattern that we follow: would rather do or would prefer to do. Okay, so infinitive without to for would rather and infinitive with to for would prefer. Let's take the same situation again. Shall we go by train? And then he's going to say, I would rather drive. And pay attention, because now we don't have the to that we saw before. Okay, because we are choosing the structure would rather, and it's followed by a bare infinitive. I'd rather drive. Okay, and obviously I would rather to drive would be incorrect. Let's take a look again at our example at the restaurant. Would you rather have red or white wine? As you can see here, Okay, after rather we have the bare infinitive, and therefore the same pattern follows here. I'd rather have white, please. Okay, in none of these situations we are using the preposition to as before, because now we are using would rather and not would prefer. Okay, but at the same time you could also say I would prefer to have white, please. Okay, this would be correct too. Okay, let's take our couple again. How about going out tonight? And then you could say it. Let's see if you have good memory. Okay, she should have said, I'd rather stay at home than go out tonight. Okay, again, I would rather plus bare infinitive, but then pay attention, this is very important, the second part. Okay, the second part you are only using than and bare infinitive without repeating rather. Okay, it's not rather than, but simply than. I would rather stay at home than go out tonight. Okay, so finally, okay, we are almost done with this presentation. So let's make or try to do a summary together. Okay, when we are speaking about our general preferences, or what do we prefer in life in general? Okay, you can say I prefer tea to coffee. In this case, okay, remember, no one is asking you if you prefer tea or coffee right now. No one is offering you tea or coffee and you need to decide. This is something that you express in general, okay? In general, okay, you prefer tea to coffee, okay? You can also say, I prefer walking to driving. Or you could also say, I prefer to walk rather than drive, all right? So, as you can see, the main verb that we use for general preferences is prefer on its own. Now, a very different thing is when we're talking about specific preferences. And then you have several options, okay? You would say, I'd prefer tea, please, okay? Or you would say, I'd prefer to drive. Or you would say, I'd rather have tea. Or you could say, I would rather drive than walk. Okay, so, summing up, remember, and this is a very important difference, okay? The first group, the general preferences, when you're talking, as I said, in general, no one is asking you, it has nothing to do with a specific moment, okay? It's something like you would say, like, I prefer going to the cinema than watching movies at home, okay? And it's, no one is asking for your opinion or anything like that. However, if you are at a friend's house and then they would ask you maybe what you would like to drink, then you would say, I would prefer tea. And it wouldn't make sense to say, I prefer tea, because this is for general preferences, okay? Because it's a specific moment and you are with your friend and she wants to know if you want it now, okay? You would need to say, I prefer tea. And the same happens with the rest of the examples, okay? Would you prefer to take the train tomorrow night or would you prefer to drive? Oh, I prefer to drive, because you're talking about a specific situation tomorrow night when you go on holiday, okay? Now, some practice for you, okay? You need to write sentences using the word in brackets, okay? So for example, starting with prefer, you could say, number one, I prefer driving to traveling by train, okay? Because remember, with the gerund ing, you need to use to in between. The second one, you have two nouns, therefore you need to say, I prefer basketball to football. Very good. And then you have two verbs and then the preposition to again. So you must say, I prefer, again, phoning people to sending emails, the gerund again. Finally, because you have rather than, okay, that is a clue about what you need to use. And then you need to say, I prefer to go to the cinema rather than watch videos at home. Oh, remember that when we are using rather than, it's because we are using prefer plus to an infinitive. Okay. Next set, okay. In this situation, you need to rewrite the same sentences so that they mean the same. So for example, I prefer driving to traveling by train. Can you rewrite it, using the to infinitive? I prefer to drive rather than travel by train, okay? Both mean the same, it's only that they use different grammatical structures, okay? The second example, I prefer phoning people to sending emails. We could also say, I prefer to phone people rather than send emails. So as you can see, it's the same example, it's the same structure as above. And finally, I prefer to go to the cinema. In this case, we need to transform it with the gerund. Therefore, you would need to say, I prefer, the right one should be, I prefer going to the cinema to watching videos at home. Okay, so we are replacing the to infinitive with the gerund, and in between we are using the preposition to. Okay, the final set. In this case, you need to choose from the three options: prefer, would rather, and would prefer. Number one, she prefers, only one possibility, working alone. Okay, we have the gerund, working, and then in between we have to. Number two, they would prefer is followed by to receive, and the second part is rather than be, okay, rather than, and the bare infinitive. Number three, I'd rather, again, I would rather is followed by bare infinitive, I'd rather invest. And number four is slightly different, okay, this is something that has to do with the preference for a different person, okay. This is something that you should have studied in the lesson, okay. And then remember, when we have different subjects, I and my daughter, we need to use I would rather, my daughter went on, okay. We use the past simple tense, okay, when we have a different subject. Since we have subject I and subject my daughter, okay, and they are different, that's why we are using the past simple. Okay, and the last part, this is meant to be a D, okay. They would prefer not to have, okay. Don't get confused with not, because remember that would prefer is followed by to an infinitive. The only thing is different is that we are placing not in front, okay. And then of course the second part is rather than do, the bare infinitive again. Number two, she prefers, pay attention because we have rather than, so only one option is possible. She prefers to study, all right? It cannot be the gerund because we have rather than. Number three, he would prefer to be an engineer, okay? After would prefer, always to infinitive. And then the final one is prefer, and then we have to, okay? So that is a clue of what you might use. We prefer, there you go, having holidays in summer to holidays in winter, okay? So we have the gerund because we have preposition to.
That's all about the discussions of the preferences. You need to know all of these explanations in details. So make sure you understand, you read the PDF file, you watch this video, you can download. If you don't understand, you can ask me, you know the phone number, and you save the file for the further understanding when the test is given to you. And make sure you respond to the form in the Google Classroom. It is necessary for you to have full score. I think that's all about this meeting, and this video and these presentations is for you. See you. Bye-bye.